Your father was a computer scientist. Your mother was a musician. When the spaceship lands, how do they communicate?
That's a very good question. I like that. You've answered the question.
At 78, Steven Spielberg did something surprising. He boiled a lifetime of wins, failures, and midnight rewrites into 7 rules he now treats like a life manual. If you don't know him, here's the short version. Spielberg is one of the most influential filmmakers in history, the mind behind blockbusters like Jaws, E.T., Jurassic Park, and deeply human films like Schindler's List and Lincoln.
As the preacher said, I could write shorter sermons, but once I start, I get too lazy to stop.
His work has shaped how generations experience story, spectacle, and emotion on screen. But these rules aren't film school theory. They're practical strategies about risk, attention, people, and purpose that translate to any life. One rule will make you question the way most of us chase quick rewards. It suggests trading immediate payoff for long-term meaning. Another forces a hard look at who you let close to you. Do they push you toward growth or keep you comfortable? Across Spielberg's career, you can spot the same thread: wonder paired with discipline, imagination held to a standard. He spent decades testing what actually produces work that lasts, and at 78, he's more interested in stewardship than applause. So whether you're an entrepreneur, a parent, a student, or someone trying to feel more fulfilled, these 7 rules offer something usable. They're less about camera tricks and more about choices you can start making tomorrow. How to protect what matters, how to structure time and boundary, how to lead with empathy while demanding excellence, and how to build for the future instead of the headlines. Listen carefully. This isn't celebrity advice dressed up as wisdom. It's the playbook of a person who spent a lifetime watching what survives and what fades. By the end of this video, you'll have concrete shifts to test in your own life, small changes that tilt decisions away from convenience and towards something that actually lasts. Rule 1. Risk smartly. Every once in a while, you have to take a leap of faith, Spielberg told the New York Times, and that line captures the heart of this rule. Risk is a lever, not a stunt.
I would never go there. I'm too good for that. I mean, I love making movies that are so different from, other movies I've made.
Spielberg famously took reduced upfront pay and back-end points on projects he believed in because he wanted ownership of the outcome, not just a paycheck. Trade-offs like that show up again and again in profiles in Variety and The Hollywood Reporter. That alignment changed how he made decisions. It made them about meaning instead of comfort. Risk, in Spielberg's hands, was almost always an engineering problem. I prepare for chaos, he told Vanity Fair, meaning he layered craft and contingency under every bold move. He didn't leap in hope. He rehearsed, rewrote, assembled reliable collaborators, and planned fallback routes. The audacious scenes and technical leaps you see on screen were rarely last-minute miracles. They were the product of exhaustive preparation that made the risk survivable. That combination, daring framed by discipline, is what turned gamble into investment. There's a moral shift inside this choice. Betting on a project with your time, reputation, or money changes how you treat it. When a director accepts back-end points instead of a big fee, the film stops being a job and becomes something personal. You behave differently. You ask harder questions. You stay for the long edit. You refuse compromises that dilute the core idea. Profiles in The Atlantic and interviews archived by BBC show this pattern across his career. The projects he personally risked for are the ones he defended most fiercely and the ones that lasted. Risk smartly also meant staging losses, so they didn't break him. Spielberg hedged bets by spreading effort across projects and building teams that could carry the load when plans failed. He reused collaborators, built relationships with studios that understood his priorities, and kept a steady creative output so a single flop didn't ruin a career. That's not a safety-first posture. It's a strategic resilience that keeps you in the game long enough for the big wins to compound. Fast decisions and bold moves are seductive, but Spielberg's example is about a specific temperament. Be willing to stake something real, but make the stake intelligent. Let your bets be shaped by craft, not desperation. Make them survivable, not fatal, and let ownership of the outcome change how you show up. Risk becomes a mechanism for accountability, a way to force higher standards and longer attention. And over time, it transforms isolated projects into a legacy. Rule 2. Protect the core. Story is king, Spielberg has said to reporters from the New York Times to Entertainment Weekly, and that phrase isn't a cliche for him, it's a battlefield order. Protecting the core means finding the single emotional truth that gives your work gravity, and refusing to let anything dilute it.
I think the toughest thing for a director to do is to know what he wants. It's not how to get what you want, it's knowing what you want.
For Spielberg, the core could be a child's wonder in E.T., the moral center in Schindler's List, or the sense of awe in Jurassic Park. He has walked off sets, cut beloved scenes, and argued with studio executives when a choice threatened that center. Outlets like Variety and The Hollywood Reporter have chronicled those standoffs. They show a pattern: when the core is defended, the film gains coherence and staying power. Protecting the core starts with ruthless clarity. You don't get to protect what you can't name. Spielberg reduces films to single emotional premises. An orphaned child meets an alien and finds home. A scientist's hubris awakens prehistoric danger, and that clarity becomes a lens for every decision. In life, the equivalent is a crisp statement of what you're trying to preserve: a mission, a relationship, a standard of quality. When that is vivid, choices get easier. You can spot distractions and say no without fuzzy explanations. Pruning is part of protection. Spielberg famously excised scenes, even those with great actors, if they weaken the emotional spine. That kind of trimming is painful because it feels like loss, but it's how the important parts breathe. Protecting the core demands the willingness to let go. Shelve projects, end partnerships, cancel ideas that pull attention away. The public sees the final film. The private work is often subtraction after subtraction until only the necessary remains. Structures enforce protection. On-set protocols, shot lists, and rehearsals guard tone and focus. In organizations and personal life, rituals and rules do the same, meeting norms that prevent scope creep, rituals that keep priorities visible, or a veto on projects that don't pass the core test. Spielberg's collaborators learn quickly what matters. When everyone understands the emotional objective, they can help preserve it rather than erode it with busy work. Transparency amplifies defense. When teams know the non-negotiable, they become active guardians. Spielberg's directors of photography, editors, and producers often describe being given a moral or emotional brief rather than technical directives. That shared language makes decisions collaborative and aligned. Tell your people the core plainly, then trust them to protect it. Protection also requires tough enforcement. Saying no will cost you offers, praise, and short-term gains. Spielberg's refusal to compromise cost him studio headaches, but preserved films that are still watched decades later. There's a social price to pruning and boundary setting. It's built into the work of stewardship. Finally, the core can evolve. Protecting it doesn't mean fossilizing it. Spielberg adapted his approach as technologies and audiences changed, but he kept the emotional center intact. Revisit the core occasionally, refine the language, test whether your guardrails still serve the mission, and allow strategic evolution without dilution. Protecting the core is the discipline that turns ambition into meaning. Name the heart, cut what dilutes it, build systems to enforce it, and be willing to pay the social costs of fidelity. When the core is secure, the rest of the work risk, hiring, routines, wonder, empathy, legacy, can align around something that genuinely matters. Rule 3. Hire courage. Spielberg has said in interviews with Vanity Fair and the New York Times that he looks for people who will risk being bad, not perfectionists who play it safe, but collaborators willing to try the risky, messy thing in service of truth.
He's like a classic painter, and he celebrates the frame, not just, what happens inside of it. And so I have to look at the searchers. Have to. Almost every time.
Hiring courage means prioritizing those who will speak up, experiment, and take emotional or intellectual risks, rather than those who merely polish what already exists. In practice, it changes the whole tempo of a team. Conversation becomes sharper, attempts grow bolder, and the work moves faster because people aren't hiding behind caution. Courage in colleagues shows up as messy behavior: a writer who pitches an idea that could fail spectacularly, an engineer who volunteers to prototype an unproven solution, a friend who calls you out when you soften your values. Those moments are uncomfortable, but they're the raw material of invention. Spielberg's sets are full of anecdotes where an actor's risky choice broke open a scene, or a technician's improvised fix created a new visual language. Profiles in The Hollywood Reporter and interviews on BBC reflect a through line. Many of his breakthroughs came when team members were allowed, even encouraged, to stumble forward. Creating a culture that attracts courageous people requires more than hiring signals. It requires protection. On his films, Spielberg created rehearsal rooms and editing spaces where failed attempts weren't punished, but examined. He buffered his crew from premature criticism so experiments could play out. That social protection permits real risk rather than performative bravado. If your environment punishes failure, you'll attract polishers, not pioneers. Leadership matters here. Courage must be modeled. Spielberg himself has taken public creative risks, embracing new technologies, reimagining genres, or defending controversial choices, and that behavior signals permission. When leaders visibly tolerate mistake-driven learning, it cascades. People begin to raise the hard questions, try the odd idea, and accept temporary loss for potential breakthrough. Hiring courage is also about seeking emotional competence. Risk without emotional regulation becomes chaos. Spielberg's collaborators often describe environments where vulnerability was matched with professionalism. Actors could break down in a scene but still return to craft. Look for people who can be raw and then refocus, who can take feedback without freezing, and who iterate quickly after failure. Tension is inevitable. Courageous teams fight, and that friction can be mistaken for dysfunction. The test is whether arguments return attention to the work rather than personal scorekeeping. Spielberg managed those tensions by anchoring debates to the story's emotional core. Disagreements were framed as fidelity to the mission, not ego contests. Adopt that habit. When conflict happens, point back to the core and ask which choice preserves it. Finally, hiring courage compounds. Brave people attract other brave people. They mentor, they normalize risk, and they raise the bar. Over time, the organization becomes one where trying is the default, and finishing imperfect, daring work becomes the norm. That momentum is fragile, though. It depends on routines and boundaries that protect deep effort, which is why the next rule is about building sacred routines. Rule 4. Sacred routine. Spielberg treats the set like a sacred workspace, a place with rules that protect focus, allow vulnerability, and make high-risk creativity possible. Sacred routines aren't about ritual for show. They're the scaffolding that turns spurts of genius into reproducible work. When you defend time, space, and process, people can take emotional and creative risks without fear of chaos or constant interruption. Routines start by naming your highest leverage work and then allocating uncompromising blocks for it. On a production, that might look like a closed rehearsal, a day devoted to one difficult shot, or a quiet editing week. In life, it looks like a regular block reserved for writing, deep design, serious conversation, or skill practice, time that is non-negotiable. The point is not busyness, but sanctity. These blocks create the conditions where subtle, high-value work can happen. Transitions and rituals matter as much as the blocks themselves. Spielberg used warm-ups, run-throughs, and specific cues to move actors into states of vulnerability. Your signals can be small: 10 minutes of preparation before a meeting, a short walk to clear the mind, or a single playlist that marks creative time. These mini rituals reduce friction and preserve the mental energy needed to enter focus quickly, which is where the real work begins. Design the environment to minimize friction and excuses. On set, that meant controlled noise, clear call times, and roles that reduced ambiguity. For individuals and teams, it means decluttering space, turning off non-essential notifications, and agreeing on norms for interruptions. When everyone honors the same rules, the cumulative effect is huge. Fewer context switches, deeper runs of concentration, and a higher tolerance for the emotional labor creative risk demands. Boundaries are the social backbone of sacred routines. Communicate your blocks clearly. Don't assume people will guess. Set expectations with colleagues and loved ones about when you are available and when you are not. Spielberg's producers and department heads learned his rhythms. They protected them. In organizations, make those boundaries visible. Shared calendars, labeled meeting types, and agreed do not disturb windows prevent polite invasions that erode momentum. Sacred routines also include rest and recovery. Longevity depends on replenishment. Sleep, exercise, small pleasures, and unscheduled white space. On long shoots, Spielberg scheduled days off and moments for play. Without that replenishment, intense focus becomes brittle. Treat recovery as part of the routine, not its opposite. Guard the rituals with gentle enforcement. When someone repeatedly violates the sacred time, address it directly. The goal is cultural protection, not authoritarian control. People should understand why the routines exist and how they serve shared aims. Over time, defenders of the routine become the culture's stewards. Finally, iterate. Routines are experiments. They must be tested, adjusted, and retired if they no longer serve. Spielberg adapted his methods as technology and team size changed. The principles stayed the same even as the tactics evolved. Keep what preserves deep work, and drop what turns into checkbox behavior. Sacred routines transform risky, messy attempts into finished work by creating space for discipline and vulnerability to coexist. They make it possible for wonder to arrive and be captured, setting the stage for the next rule. Rule 5. Keep wonder. People don't want to be told they're intelligent. They want to be shown the world anew, Spielberg has said, and that line is the engine here. Wonder isn't decorative. It's a practical tool that reshapes attention, fuels creativity, and makes work feel alive. Spielberg's big moments, the shark's shadow, a bike lifting into moonlight, a child meeting an alien, aren't mere effects. They reset the audience's emotional baseline so every subsequent beat lands deeper. You can build that reset into your life. Feed diverse inputs. Spielberg obsessively looked beyond film, model shops, museum exhibits, archival photos, children's stories. Those strange sources recombined into images and metaphors no one else had. Don't herd your attention into the same lane. Read sideways, talk to people in other trades, follow odd threads. New inputs create new connections. Protect playful failure. On set, rehearsals were permission to be bad. Silly runs produced accidental truths that were kept and refined. Create low-stakes rooms where rough attempts are valued for what they reveal, not judged for polish. A messy sketch, a 1-hour prototype, or a wild pitch can be the spark that changes a project's direction. Use constraints to force invention. Limits sharpen imagination. Jurassic Park's mechanical limits push designers to inventive, practical solutions. Constraints focused energy. Try tight formats, one-day experiments, 10-minute demos, single-page problems, and watch creativity concentrate into surprising forms. Design sensory cues. Wonder is often bodily, sound, light, scale. Small rituals, an unusual playlist before deep work, rotating visuals in a workspace, a weekly walk in a new neighborhood, reset perception. Spielberg used sound and scale deliberately. You can use modest sensory shifts to break habituation, create protected no-cynic times. Metrics and deadlines kill curiosity if they dominate every meeting. Carve out spaces where half-baked ideas are aired without ROI pressure. A weekly show and tell, a curiosity hour, or a casual demo slot. Naming those zones lowers the social cost of looking foolish and keeps novelty visible. Practice beginner's humility. Stay a student, ask naive questions, invite fresh eyes, and let novices teach without defensiveness. Spielberg remained curious about new tech and forms. That humility preserved his edge. Share small discoveries quickly. Wonder spreads through short, visible moments. A clip, a demo, a story. Make sharing cheap and frequent so surprises propagate. Institutionalize curiosity. Budget tiny experiments. Protect white space. Schedule curiosity days. Spielberg baked wonder into process. When curiosity is a system, surprise becomes repeatable rather than accidental. Rule 6. Lead with empathy. Find the human moment, Spielberg told the New York Times, and that directive is the practical core of this rule. Lead by creating conditions where people can risk honestly and do their best work. Empathy here is structural, not sentimental. It means naming emotional aims, protecting experimental space, giving actionable feedback, and enforcing standards without shaming. When actors give their most vulnerable performances, someone on set licensed that risk. The same dynamic makes teams, families, and organizations produce depth instead of defensiveness. Begin by stating the human aim. In interviews with Vanity Fair and The Atlantic, Spielberg explains scenes and feelings, not metrics. Fear, wonder, grief. So every department can align decisions around one emotional target. Translate that. Describe desired impact in human terms before you discuss KPIs. People orient differently when they understand who they're serving and why it matters. Protect rehearsal and rehearsal-like buffers. Spielberg built private screenings and rehearsal days so rough attempts could be tried away from public scrutiny. Create similar buffers, dry runs, pilot releases, internal demos. These safe zones lower the reputational cost of experimentation and let teams iterate without fear of immediate judgment. Give feedback that enables action. Spielberg's notes often point to a single emotional turn or concrete adjustment. Adopt that brevity. Name one observable change, explain its emotional effect, and suggest a next move. That format converts critique into practice and keeps people moving rather than freezing under vague criticism. Model vulnerability while maintaining craft. Empathy doesn't mean lax standards. Spielberg admits mistakes publicly and defends collaborators, yet still demands excellence. That combination builds trust. Leaders who show how they recover from failure and then insist on quality create cultures where people stretch without fear of abandonment. Protect psychological safety when stakes are high. Creative pressure breeds anxiety. Enforce norms that separate critique of work from critique of people. Ban public shaming and require respectful candor. Safety doesn't remove friction. It makes friction productive. Invest in growth. Spielberg rehired and mentored people repeatedly, turning promising contributors into trusted lieutenants. Empathetic leaders look beyond the immediate deliverable and ask how this work advances someone's craft. Provide coaching, stretch assignments, and visible development paths. Balance care with accountability. Empathy without expectations becomes permissive. Accountability without care becomes cruel. Pair supportive coaching with clear outcomes and deadlines. People take smarter risks when they know they'll be backed in failure, but also held to recovery. Routinize empathy into small practices, brief emotional primers before sessions, short post-mortem decompressions, and regular well-being check-ins, so that compassion scales beyond occasional speeches. Spielberg's sets didn't rely on charisma alone, they used repeatable rituals to protect vulnerability. Lead with empathy, and the work gains depth. Pressure becomes productive, failure becomes learning, and people give more than they thought they could. Rule 7. Think legacy. At 78, Spielberg's focus has shifted from trophies to stewardship. In interviews with the New York Times and Variety, he talks less about awards and more about passing knowledge, preserving archives, and shaping institutions that outlast him. Thinking legacy reframes short-term success as a chapter in a longer story. Your choices become investments in people, systems, and standards that survive you. Legacy starts with a horizon longer than the next quarter. Spielberg's moves, mentoring directors, funding film preservation, and structuring deals that favored story over immediate profit are calibrated for decades, not headlines. For anyone building design work so it can be inherited. On film sets, that meant meticulous documentation, trusted deputies, and reproducible workflows. Collaborators could step in and preserve tone. In other fields, create playbooks, record processes, and train successors. Legacy isn't accidental. It's a product of deliberate handoffs. Make it easy for someone to carry the work forward, without having to reinvent the values that made it good. Invest in people and institutions, not just outputs. Spielberg repeatedly reinvested his capital, time, money, influence into institutions and mentorship programs that amplify impact. Teaching someone to lead multiplies returns more than doing another project yourself. Sponsor apprentices, fund training, and create structures that elevate future leaders. Over time, those investments compound into cultural change. Make decisions that pay forward. Sometimes the most legacy-friendly moves look like sacrifices, taking less credit to give others visibility, choosing durable quality over viral success, or protecting archives instead of monetizing immediately. These choices carry social cost now, but preserve long-term value. Spielberg's refusal of certain compromises often puzzled studios, but made his body of work coherent decades later. Preserve values and systems. Legacy survives when values are encoded, not only preached. Create norms, incentives, and governance that reward the behaviors you want to continue. If generosity, curiosity, and rigor matter, set up promotion criteria, reward systems, and budget lines that keep them alive. Institutions drift without encoded incentives. Legacy-proof them. Tell the story of the work. Narratives transmit values. Spielberg curates how his films and practices are remembered through interviews, restorations, and archival projects. Share the history and rationale behind key choices, so successors inherit not just tasks but purpose. When people understand why things mattered, they're likelier to protect them. Accept asymmetric rewards. Legacy often yields delayed or distributed returns. Community respect, derivative work, or cultural shifts rather than immediate profit. Embrace that asymmetry. Measure success with broader metrics like influence, resilience, and continuity. Finally, be willing to cede control. Stewardship means trusting others to evolve the work. Spielberg mentors and then steps back. He accepts changes that fit new times, while keeping core values intact. Legacy is living, not museum piece. Allow successors to adapt while holding them accountable to the mission. Thinking legacy turns career moves into care work. You stop optimizing for applause and start cultivating what endures. That posture changes present behavior subtly but profoundly. Your risks, hires, routines, and empathy become deliberate contributions to a future you may not see, which is perhaps the most Spielbergian rule of all. Taken together, these 7 rules are less about camera angles and more about how to live with intention. Take calculated risks, protect your core, build brave relationships, guard your routines, keep wonder alive, lead with empathy, and build for what comes after you. That's a playbook for anyone who wants fulfillment, not just fame. For Spielberg at 78, that's the point. He's not teaching people how to be famous. He's showing how to make things that last. Which rule will you start living by tomorrow? Sound off in the comments below, and subscribe while you're there.